Well, Australia is grappling to find the best strategy to move away from harsh lockdowns in our major cities right now. Prime Minister Scott Morrison has looked to change his messaging over the past week or so. But what is the message now and will it work? Ebony Bennett is the Deputy Director of the Australia Institute. Ebony, great to see you. Tell us a bit about what you've seen from the Prime Minister and perhaps what the response has been from some others in the community over potential doubts around his messaging.
Yeah, so we've seen a huge focus from the Prime Minister on this national plan for opening up once we get to vaccination rates of 70 or 80%. But there's a bit of a concern now that this is much more spin than it is based on science. So we've seen this week some questions around some of the assumptions in that Doherty Institute modelling that underpins that national plan. And basically that's because modelling is only as good as the assumptions that you put into it. And one of the assumptions in that modelling that the national plan rests on is that the effectiveness of our testing, tracing, isolating and quarantine system, TTIQ, remains essentially as good as it was in Victoria when it hit its peak of about 700 cases a day last year. But what we can see in New South Wales now is that already as case numbers explode or continue growing, the effectiveness of TTIQ declines. New South Wales is already several weeks behind in tracking down and testing and isolating cases. It's got growing numbers of mystery cases. So there's questions now around if we're opening up at this 70 or 80%, can we really be assured that the other public health measures such as TTIQ are really going to stay as effective? So potentially that's a bit of a hole at the centre of this national plan. Another big problem is we're seeing that the vaccination rates aren't consistent across the community, and particularly in vulnerable communities like Indigenous communities. There's a huge gap between vaccination rates there and vaccination rates for the general population, and that gap is widening in every single state except Victoria. And the head of the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisations, the peak body, Pat Turner, is calling for basically 100% vaccination rates in Aboriginal communities before we open up. Otherwise, we're essentially sacrificing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who we know are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19.
Let's turn our attention to the latest from the coal power stations. The Energy Security Board is recommending subsidies. Tell us a bit more about this story.
Yeah, so the Energy Security Board is looking at how the national energy market can move away or deal with the fact that many coal-fired power stations, they're ageing, they're unreliable, and they're heading out of the market by about 2030. We've seen around 1,000 days of outages from coal-fired power because they've exploded or other unintended reasons that they've shut down. The Energy Security Board is proposing to essentially just force consumers to subsidise these ageing coal generators for the reliability and security of the grid. That's facing huge challenges from innovative energy companies and clean energy companies. We saw an open letter to federal and state energy ministers and the ESB yesterday, essentially opposing this plan because it'll increase emissions, it'll increase costs for consumers, it'll reduce competition, and effectively it's just going to prop up these unreliable and unprofitable coal-fired power stations. So even though this probably has a long way to go, I think several states aren't really happy with this way forward, and we'll probably see them ask the Energy Security Board to go back to the drawing board on a few of these proposals.
Just a final one on that. I was just thinking about, as you were speaking, where does the power lie at the moment in this conversation? There are two sides to it. Of course, the coal-fired power stations have been a part of Australia for decades now, and many say we need to move right away from it. In terms of the power, the political power, you know, is it the Nationals, is it Prime Minister Scott Morrison? Like, who's going to end up making some of these decisions over the coming months and years, I suppose?
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. I think the federal government is heavily on the side of propping up fossil fuel generators like coal and gas power. That's their preferred method. But certainly at the state level, we're seeing states like New South Wales and Tasmania, you know, really going hard with plans for investment in clean energy. So the New South Wales government, its proposal for, or its plan for massive renewable energy zones really is leading the nation when it comes to bringing online more renewable energy generation, which we know is cheaper for consumers and is ready to roll out now. Now, the states hold significant power when it comes to managing the national electricity market because they all manage, poles and wires generation all within their own states. So it's going to be really interesting to see this play out because the federal government is really pushing in one direction, but the states are pushing, or several states are pushing in a very different clean energy direction, and they still hold significant power. So it remains to be seen, obviously, who will win out, but certainly capital is moving to clean energy and abandoning coal and fossil fuels in the long term.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.